Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mesa, Arizona for the 2012 Counterfeit Parts Avoidance Symposium. I'm happy to see a nice full house here. We have some great content for you today with some outstanding experts from the SAE G19 counterfeit committees. I think you'll find the whole program to be quite educational. And please, I put some question cards out there. We'll have a panel at the end of the day. That is basically an open forum, so as you go through the day and you have some questions, save them up and we'll have a chance to grill the experts, if you will, at the end. So again, I welcome you and thank you for coming out. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kevin Sink so we can get the program underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, I'm Kevin Sink, the Vice President of Quality at TTI. I'm honored to be here today with you, and I'm very thankful to all of you for coming. It's not easy always to have a seminar on a Friday, so thank you very much for coming out to see us today. We have some of the brightest minds in counterfeit electronics avoidance here today, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Henry Livingston. Mr. Livingston is a Technical Director and Engineering Fellow with BAE Systems, widely published on component reliability assessment, obsolescence management, and counterfeit electronics. I've heard him speak before on the topic he'll present to you today, and I think you'll be very impressed and learn quite a bit on this topic. He'll be speaking to us today as we learned about Section 818 of the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. And this is an act which will impact our industry, though the issue has been impacting our industry. We've all been reacting to it, obviously, for many years. So without further ado, Mr. Henry Livingston.
Good morning. A pleasure to be here today. 5 years ago, Phil, wasn't it 5 years ago, a month ago, was when the SAE G19 committee first formed. And thanks to the vision of Brian Hewitt from NASA, who saw a looming problem and saw the need for standards activity in that area. And then with the leadership of Phil Zaletta, chair of G19 committee, starting 5 years ago, resulted in the release of AS 5553 in about a year and a half, which is pretty fast for standards activity, especially with what at the time was really fundamentally new ground for developing standards activity in this area. So, and what I'll be describing today is as this, I'm going to need some help here because this is Phil's briefing. Okay. Okay.
That one? No.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
So almost a year ago, when the Senate Armed Services Committee had held a hearing on the subject of counterfeit parts and its infiltration into the DoD supply chain as a result of a study they had initiated in about November of 2010. Again, getting back to 5 years ago, at about the time that the G19 committee started, was when we started seeing this spinning up in the press with some specific trade journals, more in the defense and aerospace industry. Subsequent to that, some major arrests and prosecutions that have really helped us understand even more the insidious nature of the supply chain that can be associated with this product and legislation activity. I'll start initially here describing some of the areas where this presents a significant challenge to DoD and its suppliers in dealing with this issue. And one area that seems to have been well understood by the Senate Armed Services Committee is that the products that we develop and are deployed by DoD are in service for decades. And this is not like cell phones, iPads, or whatever that technology turns very frequently, and the products that are designed into them are made obsolete because they're not the latest and greatest technology. So we're dealing with a situation where a number of the technologies that are used in supported weapon systems go obsolete and are no longer in production far earlier than the end need date for systems that are out there for decades. And coupled with the issue that it's been several decades since DoD or the aerospace industry in general had a significant influence on the semiconductor or electronic components market, as seen as a large enough slice of their total world market to influence the supply chain to continue to support products. Confluence of that with e-waste making its way offshore, individuals in the small businesses that they've developed harvesting product out of electronic waste, and that seems to be the predominant area where counterfeit parts are finding their way into the supply chain. And certainly a concern in addition to parts being identified as being something different than they really are. These components take a beating during these disassembly processes. I'll put to you that any company who knows what they're doing in their rework and repair operations does not treat material this way because it's very bad. It causes a number of issues, so there's also a reliability issue associated with products that are potentially counterfeit from the standpoint of they may work today, but you really don't have a sense as to what their expected life would be. And that was certainly a major part of the discussion of Lieutenant General O'Reilly's testimony at the hearing. There were two studies that really drove a lot of what the legislation set as a foundation, the first and foremost being the Commerce study, which was put out in 2010, but data was made available. And some summary analysis of what this data meant started popping up as late as 2008 in the fall. I remember first seeing the presentations at a DMSMS conference that identified a number of issues which really fundamentally had to deal with understanding where you buy your parts from. And depending on where you buy your parts from, what types of assurance mechanisms should you have in place to be satisfied that you're going to have product with integrity. That follow-on study was from the Government Accountability Office, which was released shortly afterward, and that study started in the spring of 2009 with very similar themes with respect to understanding where counterfeit parts come from, supply chain weaknesses associated with the movement of that product, and applying practices to avoid escapes, and pointing to a concern that perhaps the U.S. government and DoD were not looking at some of the newer methodologies that were being put in place to deal with the issue and recommending that DoD deal with that. After the hearing that took place on November 8th of last year, at that time the Senate Armed Services Committee had already drafted an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to integrate what they had found from the previous studies as well as their own analysis of what had occurred after sending requests to a dozen or so contractors and a number of other suppliers and test laboratories, revealing that over a shorter period of time than the Commerce study had looked at, that they had revealed 1,800 instances of counterfeits that had been acquired to the amount of over 1 million individual piece parts. And again, finding the same fundamental issues as identified in the other studies. And that went into place for implementation. The effective date was the very first of this year. I'll quickly go through the key elements here, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from Mr. Torelli during the keynote luncheon talk that he'll give but one major element that was discovered by the Senate Armed Services Committee was the cost associated with fixing a counterfeit parts problem was being passed on to the DoD customer and in turn the taxpayer. That wasn't viewed very favorably. So the major piece of the legislation drives towards the costs associated to remedy a counterfeit parts issue is not to be passed on to the government, unallowable costs. So I'm sure that a number of individuals in the room associated with companies that are certainly prime contractors and second-tier contractors have been engaging this, but there are some lower-tier suppliers here, I'm sure, are starting to see queries from their customers about new clauses that they might be applying in order to deal with the flow down of cost consequences. One major element that was included in the legislation was, for the first time, something that expressed a preference for what types of suppliers you get your parts from. Preference to be to get components from the original producer or their authorized dealers, understanding at the same time that there are circumstances, particularly in obsolescence cases, that can't be resolved by a redesign without introducing a number of other significant problems for the DoD customer to deal with, that there will be cases where you need to wander off that path and apply due diligence to deal with that. Also, for the first time, calls for DoD and contractors to have practices in place to embed within their operating procedures in terms of dealing with counterfeit avoidance, and also deals with the issue of reporting. One of the major points of discussion that was brought up during the hearing was the lack of reporting. One company discovers a counterfeit. They may not necessarily have communicated to other business units within the same corporation that a counterfeit event occurred, and they may be using the same product and potentially be vulnerable. They may not have communicated to their customer. They may not have communicated through an organization like the Government Industry Data Exchange Program for the benefit of other users who might be using the same product or the same suppliers and potentially be vulnerable. So there was an expectation that their reporting become a major part of this. And then outside of the DoD space was recognizing that some steps can be taken to grant further authority to Homeland Security to allow them to do some of the things they already know need to be done with respect to intercepting this product at the border. So there was a number of provisions added for that. Major element here, and I just had a discussion briefly this morning about how DCMA has been starting some assessment of contractors and other suppliers in terms of assessing their readiness to deal with specific requirements in the NDAA. And I'm sure a number of you have been seeing that and looking to, in effect, cover what the second bullet calls for, which is establishing business systems, specific practices for implementing key elements of these requirements. So this will be a key element in terms of how suppliers and contractors are evaluated. Also adopted provisions for increasing criminal sentencing at the individual level as well as the organizational level for tracking, for trafficking and counterfeit products. And also calls for some development of and implementation of specific definitions that are key to implementing this. Now here's just the timeline as it was expressed in the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 818, in terms of DoD's implementation, fell into, in effect, 3 windows. And within 180 days, which was mid-year, was for DoD to have assessed its own policies and systems with respect to defining terms, issuing guidance, and with respect to its own purchase of electronic parts, and guidance on dealing with problem suppliers, and also for reporting. And a number of you have probably seen a memo that was put out by Mr. Kendall back in March, which covered several of these elements and a number of other elements as well. And also, Mr. Kendall's memo goes beyond electronic parts. Even though the NDAA focuses on electronic parts, Mr. Kendall's memo broadens that aperture in terms of implementation. 270 days, which is about this time frame, was the point to where changes to or the introduction of new regulations was to start with respect to contractor responsibilities, again, from the standpoint of the introduction of the avoidance of getting counterfeits into the supply chain, and the costs associated with escapes are in the hands of the contractor, and also dealing with avoidance and remedies of escapes and those costs. Some definitions associated with the use of trusted suppliers, not to be confused with the DoD Trusted Foundry Program, but in the context of Certain categories of suppliers are, you need to establish a trust category in terms of being comfortable that particular suppliers have sufficient elements in place to avoid passing on counterfeits, as well as a reporting requirement. And then the other 270-day window, and as I had mentioned earlier, some of us have started seeing some assessment activity going on through DCMA already with respect to improvement of contractor systems. And I'll point out the line here which talks about having policies and procedures to eliminate counterfeit electronic parts from the defense supply chain, which is, a number of us have been saying for quite a while, pretty tall order from the standpoint of the influence that the defense market has on the lower levels within the supply chain, and a number of things can be done, certainly to shore up defenses and minimize the penetration of counterfeits, but outright elimination is a pretty tall order. So don't be surprised as you see the government looking at business systems in that light from the standpoint of elimination. And also that these evaluation of these processes will be the basis of the government's review and approval for these business systems in their evaluations. And I'll start getting into the implications specific to DoD contractors. Now, there are a number of elements in the NDAA that are very smart and are very consistent with what a number of us have been espousing for over half a decade now in terms of the right things to do and what are some of the more robust practices that need to be in place, specifically with respect to the element in the NDAA that calls for a preference of where you buy your parts from the original producer and authorized supplier, and adopting internal systems to implement all of these practices, reporting through GUIDEP, also not necessarily an issue for all contractors, but for some there had been a concern that the act of reporting a counterfeit part incident could expose a contractor to liability from the standpoint of identifying or associating a specific supplier with the sale of a counterfeit. There are provisions in the NDAA that disarm that. So simply on the basis of reporting a counterfeit event is not a basis for civil liability. Also, that these provisions not only apply to DoD's suppliers, contractors, and other types of suppliers, it also applies to DoD itself as it buys material, and also enhancing the authority of CBP to prevent parts from finding their way in the supply chain. Those are key elements that a number of us have been pushing for a while. Now, that said, there are a number of implementation issues that can present a concern to contractors and anybody who's been having discussions with upper tier contractors in terms of dealing this issue. These kind of things tend to come up in discussions. For example, the cost of to remedy a counterfeit part escape falls on the shoulders of the contractor. In the description within the NDAA, it's not really very clear as to what cost of rework and corrective action means. I think generally speaking, contractors understand that this is more than just replacing the parts themselves and the costs associated. I think we all get that. And I think generally speaking, we all nod and say, yeah, we understand that. But from the standpoint, lower tier contractor provides a part in an assembly that goes into an airplane, and that the counterfeit event creates a serious problem which pulls in a number of costs incurred by the government to refit hardware, prime contractor to refit, requalify. Do all those costs all get rolled up and included as a part of the remediation costs? That needs to be more clearly defined. Also, in terms of treatment of counterfeits, not all counterfeits have disastrous consequences, okay? And also the applications for even the same item can vary in a huge way depending on the system, criticality of the application, environment, a number of elements that are really dependent on the specific application, but there's no treatment in terms of dealing with the cost remediation depending on what the impact is with respect to a risk assessment type The NDAA does talk about a risk management approach much explicit definition, and I can see from, say, myself, or quite a bit of the information I've seen from various parts of the government that have been working on the risk-based approach. The folks that I know who are working to understand this, okay? How this manifests itself until we see policies and regs come out during this gestation period is another matter. Another concern, particularly for primes and second-tier contractors, is that the Senate Armed Services Committee definitely understood where the parts come from. I mean, they understand that contractors are not going out of their way to buy counterfeits. They understand that who they're buying their parts from may not be the smartest choice under certain circumstances, and due diligence may not have been sufficient, but they did understand where these occurrences tend to be initiated within the supply chain. However, there's nothing in the NDAA that drives any change in that area at all. This is all on the shoulder of the contractors to deal with, and the contractor's responsible for the authentication of the product, regardless of that. So that's a concern. So it's, in terms of, we're anxious to see what happens with the definition of trusted supplier in that context, and also too with respect to even a trusted supplier has the potential to pass on a counterfeit. Do the consequences change if I use a trusted supplier? So there are a number of elements associated with that. Other challenges. Those of you who have dealt with circumstances where you're either buying parts and trying to understand what you're considering buying, or you have a circumstance where you have reason to question what you've bought and you need some help. Everybody agrees that the best place to get information on whether a part is authentic or not is from the original manufacturer, okay? However, even though there was an extensive discussion on this topic at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing about the amount of support, about the lack of support from the semiconductor industry, particularly in the case of obsolete products, are the only products that are, there's no place to go to buy products. So in the case of obsolete products, there is some assistance that's needed to deal with that issue, but there was nothing in the NDAA that addressed that issue at all. So contractors are still dealing with a circumstance where there's reluctance on the part of the original manufacturers to support that for a number of reasons. I'm sure Lonnie will probably get into that later today too, but it's just another constraint that we're dealing with in this issue. Contractor systems, so the practices and procedures associated with counterfeit avoidance and detection are falling under the business systems characterization, under something along the lines of the business systems rule, and that this being under the purview of DOD's review and approval now takes a single event with respect to its impact on a specific project or a specific event. This can now have consequences with respect to your business system approval. It's entirely possible that after an event or two, the government may say, gee, you really don't have your act together here, so I'm now going to take action to see that you fix your problems and may withhold payment on contracts until you fix your issues. So this is more than one event hits one program. You have one event that can affect your entire enterprise. So that's a major thing to keep in mind. Also, this can present concerns as to whether or not, despite any analysis that may have been done with respect to the specific use of the part, its application, and that kind of risk assessment, could you still be put into jeopardy regardless of what due diligence you put into place to mitigate the risk? And also whether or not you bought parts from trusted suppliers or not. Other areas which I'll go through really quickly is definition of electronic part, introduced by the House, by the way, not Senate Armed Services Committee, includes a circuit assembly. To my knowledge, there isn't a lot of standards activity that defines how you deal with that. Beyond, okay, if you apply AS 5553 stuff, if you're an assembly producer, that's fine, but from the standpoint of the assembly itself and how you deal with that issue. There is really nothing out there, to my knowledge, that deals with that. There is an expectation, subtle statement within the NDAA that indicates that wherever a purchase from other than the original manufacturer authorized distributor, wherever that purchase may occur within the supply chain, DOD is to be informed of that. And they may be 5 times removed, okay? So that's something to keep in mind depending on what we see in the regulations and what you see in flow downs. And certainly if that also turns into beyond notification, it's wait until you get a concurrence on what you're doing for due diligence. That's something that folks are really going to need to step up and take some time to plan out. There are some particular issues with respect to the timing and who within the supply chain would report an event that should be taken into account. And also disposition. What do you do if you find counterfeits? What do you do with them? We understand we don't want to return them because they'll find their way back into the supply chain again. But what's the expectation of the contractor, whoever holds them? Okay, there are still suspect counterfeits that we found over half a decade ago that we're still waiting for investigators to come by and look for samples for evidence. They haven't done that in all these cases. So we're not sure how much longer are we supposed to hold on to these. And we're concerned as to whether or not, gee, if we just decide at one point that we're going to crush these and mix them in the concrete and dump the bricks out in the ocean somewhere, whether there will be concern that we may now have disarmed the government's ability to pursue an investigation. So there's issues with disposition that need to be dealt with. One of the major points that was brought up by Lieutenant General Riley at the hearing were the costs associated with counterfeit part escapes that affected the Missile Defense Agency. And that at that time, while I think they were probably still even quantifying the impacts, at that time the amount was understood to be about $4.5 million, and they were still sorting out who was going to pay the bill associated with those costs. I would put to you that any large company that has had counterfeit parts issues, that number is not going to shock them much, okay? So if you look at this from the standpoint of a major event or series of events, you're not passing this off to DOD anymore. You're going to eat that, okay? These slides get into more of the details of each one of the implementation sets for DOD's implementation of the NDAA. I want to bring your attention to this one. If you're looking for something which will describe what your counterfeit parts avoidance and detection business system should have in place, this is the short list of elements that are specifically identified on the list of things that DOD is to assess when they're looking at what a contractor does. So as any of you folks who are dealing with contractors or second tiers, you probably have already seen, and if you're not, you're going to see queries with respect to what you're doing in each one of these particular areas, and this will be the basis of the government's assessment of your readiness. I'll close with a few misconceptions. I remember hearing about these half a decade ago, and even today I still hear some of these misconceptions about to what extent this problem applies to my company or my enterprise. Popular statement has been, gee, I don't buy parts, so it's not me. I don't have to worry about that. Well, no, that's not true, because the way this is crafted is whether you buy parts or whether you buy assemblies that somewhere deep down within include electronic parts, you own this, period. Or that, gee, I'm buying COTS. And COTS has diplomatic immunity for requirements for everything, right? I mean, that tends to be, I'm laughing a little bit, but I'm an engineer, so I may say things a little on the rough and tumble side, okay? But, fundamentally, this is the kind of tone that we get with respect to, oh, it's COTS, get away from me, don't tell me what to do. Well, there's nothing in the NDAA that says that COTS is immune, okay? And that could apply to a company that does fundamentally DOD business, but tout that they have a COTS process through a common build mechanism that they apply, or it could apply to, I'm buying a blade server from Hewlett-Packard, okay? And Hewlett-Packard will tell you, you want to avoid counterfeit stuff? You buy it from me or my authorized dealer, end of story. Don't bug me about where I buy my parts, and don't flow this stuff down. I won't accept your order. So there's a number of issues with that. So, but please understand that from the standpoint, there's nothing in the NDAA that says that COTS is given a hall pass for this. Now, there have been suggestions on how to deal with some of these issues, and we'll see what comes out in implementation and regulations. Also, another common statement is, oh, the parts supplier is responsible. Well, okay. Parts supplier may be dealing with debarment, okay, and the fines and sentencing and jail time associated with that. However, I can tell you, any large company will tell you that the kind of warranties you get from a part supplier, even from the OCM, is not going to cover the costs associated with a not so great event associated with a counterfeit part. Also, too, the legislation is specifically clear about even if you don't buy it from a trusted supplier and you're allowed to go buy from other folks, you know, good luck with your supplier, but we're holding your feet to the fire in terms of the consequences of an event. So regardless of where the part finds its way into the supply chain, the legislation is pretty clear that it's really the upper tiers that are put in the hot seat on this, okay? So I think the timing of this particular symposium is very good because from the standpoint of the regulations and DoD implementation will be coming forward shortly. You'll be hearing a number of briefings today that kind of give you folks an insight as to the number of issues that suppliers deal with, that users deal with, mitigation approaches and other issues associated with this that I think we'll find very useful. And I, for one, am very looking forward to today's briefings and my esteemed colleagues here and elsewhere in the room today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I'll do my best to bring up the next presentation. I got lucky. Our next speaker is a gentleman whom I've come to know as having the patience of Job. He has the interpersonal skill of a diplomat and the leader of a true altruist. That's Mr. Phil Zulueta. Phil is currently an independent consultant, previously a program element manager with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, where he's responsible for a team that performed many of the methods of component evaluation and protection. He's held similar responsibilities at well-known leaders in our industry, such as Electro Science Laboratories, Ball Aerospace, Hughes Microelectronics, and Northrop Grumman. Phil holds a master's degree from Pepperdine and an undergraduate degree from Cal State in Long Beach. Please join me in welcoming the head of the G19 SAE committee, Mr. Phil Zulueta. Not sure if I've put that forward on here.
That's the end. Let's try this. All right. Thank you, Kevin. Well, let's see. My talk today is stated up here, but basically, as Henry had indicated, the first standard that the G19 committee developed and released was AS 5553. And within a few months of its release, I started to get emails and telephone calls that, this standard is good. It looks like it appeared to have broad global acceptance, but it was still lacking on certain things. For example, people wanted to see more international content. Well, when we developed 5553, it was clearly US-centric. We had no idea that, even though we knew that the problem was global, we had no idea that the standard would have such wide